October 1994. Union, South Carolina. Search crews fan out across dark water. Boats cut slowly through the surface of a quiet lake. On shore, officers, volunteers, and reporters watch and wait. For 9 days, a small town, then an entire nation, is fixated on one story. A young mother tells police her car was taken by a stranger and that her 2 sons were still inside. Roadblocks are set up. National news broadcasts carry their photographs. Prayer vigils spring up as people across the United States follow every update, hoping for good news. But as the search continues, investigators begin to notice inconsistencies in her account. Details don't align. Timelines are rechecked. Statements are compared. On the 9th day, everything changes. The story that captured national sympathy takes a shocking turn when Susan Smith confesses the truth about what happened. Not rumor, not speculation, but the documented events recorded by law enforcement and contemporaneous reporting. This is the story of a missing children's search that gripped a nation and ended in a confession that stunned the world. The case of Susan Smith. Union, South Carolina, October 1994. A quiet town became the focus of intense national attention when Susan Smith reported that her car had been taken at a traffic signal and that her 2 young sons were inside the vehicle. She told police a stranger, later described as a black man, had carjacked her and driven off with her children. Law enforcement agencies immediately opened a missing children investigation. Within hours, the case spread from local coverage to national headlines. Photographs of 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander appeared on television screens across the United States. Search teams were organized. Lakes, back roads, and wooded areas near Union were examined in hopes of finding the boys or the vehicle reported missing. People across the country followed the story, holding out hope for the boys' safe return. This was a period when high-profile missing child cases received intense 24-hour media coverage, and this case became one of the most widely reported of the decade. Press conferences were held, investigators provided regular updates, and the community gathered for vigils and public appeals. Behind the scenes, detectives worked through standard investigative procedures. They reviewed timelines, retraced movements, examined physical evidence, and interviewed witnesses and family members. As the search continued, investigators began to notice inconsistencies in the mother's account, and questions grew more difficult to set aside. What began as a search effort soon developed into a complex criminal investigation. Over the days that followed, public appeals for help gave way to growing suspicion and ultimately to a confession that would change the direction of the case entirely. This documentary explores how the investigation unfolded, what was recorded in court proceedings and law enforcement reports, and how a small-town disappearance became a national story. 2 missing children, a mother's report that drew a nation's attention, and an investigation whose findings altered the story forever. Before her name became synonymous with one of the most shocking crimes of the 1990s, Susan Lee Smith was a young woman from Union, South Carolina. She was born on September 26, 1971, and grew up in the same small community where the events of October 1994 would unfold. Those closest to her remembered a childhood that included significant emotional challenges. Her father died by suicide when she was young, and she later suffered abuse from her stepfather, experiences that contributed to struggles with depression and at least one suicide attempt in her teenage years. Smith married David Smith, and they had 2 sons, Michael, born in 1991, and Alexander, born in 1993. Their marriage was described in contemporaneous reporting and public records as troubled, marked by separations, conflicts, and financial strain. As she entered adulthood, friends and acquaintances noted that Susan often seemed overwhelmed, anxious, and emotionally fragile. Mental health issues, including depression and past suicide attempts, were later raised during her 1995 trial as part of the defense narrative, though they did not excuse her actions. This was the woman behind the headlines. A young mother with a complicated personal history and emotional struggles that would become part of the public record and the broader understanding of the case. Not to explain what happened, not to excuse it, but to understand the background of a life before the crime that would shock the nation. They were at the center of the story long before the headlines and far beyond the courtroom. Two young boys whose lives were measured not in years but in moments. Michael Daniel Smith was 3 years old. Alexander Alex Tyler Smith was 14 months old. Public records and widely reported news accounts describe them simply and tragically. Brothers, sons, and part of a family in Union, South Carolina. Michael, the older brother, was a lively preschooler full of energy and curiosity, known for his eagerness to play and explore. Alex, still a baby, followed closely at Michael's side, content beside his older brother and wrapped in the warmth of family life. Photos later shown in national news broadcasts and printed in newspapers revealed two ordinary boys in sneakers and t-shirts, snapshots of everyday childhood before tragedy struck. Their faces, once familiar only to family and neighbor, soon became known across the United States during the frantic search that gripped the nation in 1994. They were sons, they were grandsons, they were part of a community, and they had futures that were never allowed to unfold. In this case, much of the focus would fall on the investigation, the confession, the courtroom. But at the heart of it were two children. Too young to understand fear, too young to defend themselves, and far too young to bear the weight of the story that would be told about them. Their names, Michael and Alex, remain recorded in every public account and memorial, not for what happened to them, but for who they were. Two little brothers, two short lives, two children who should have had the chance to grow up. On the night of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith called authorities in Union, South Carolina, and reported a crime that would capture national attention. She told police that as she waited at a traffic signal, a stranger forcibly entered her car and drove away, with her two young sons still in the back seat. She claimed the man was an African American who pushed her out of the vehicle and sped off with the children and her car. In the first hours of the response, law enforcement treated her account as a possible child abduction and carjacking. Flyers with the boys' photos were distributed. Press conferences were held. For 9 days, she made emotional public pleas for the return of her sons, and volunteers searched the countryside believing the boys were alive. For a time, the frightening image of a stranger at a stoplight, a stolen car, and two missing children became the version of events believed by many across the country. In the hours after Susan Smith reported her sons missing on October 25, 1994, law enforcement and the community sprang into action. Local officers and state agents combed Union County, searching highways, back roads, wooded areas, and bodies of water for any trace of 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander. Flyers with their photographs and the description of the reported missing burgundy Mazda circulated widely as police followed dozens of leads and tips. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division worked alongside local authorities, and federal resources were called in to assist in coordinating the effort. Hundreds of volunteers joined grid searches, trailed wooded trails and lake shores, and distributed missing child posters across the region. News cameras broadcast the boys' faces nationwide, and the community held vigils in Union as hopes grew for their safe return. For days, hundreds of officers, volunteers, and citizens searched tirelessly, checked every reported sighting, and pursued every potential clue. The story had become a nationwide manhunt: a mother's missing children, a vanished car, and an unknown suspect believed to be on the run. But as the public search continued, investigators quietly began to question whether the initial account told by Susan Smith added up. As days passed with no sign of the missing car or the two young boys, investigators began examining the story Susan Smith had given them more closely. From the start, she claimed a stranger had taken her car and children. But detectives soon found elements of her account that did not add up. They found no witnesses to the alleged carjacking, no physical evidence of the supposed suspect, and no confirmed sightings of the vehicle she described. Police gave Smith a polygraph test, and the results raised concerns. Officials publicly acknowledged they were reviewing inconsistencies in her statements even while the search continued. One detail that drew scrutiny involved the traffic signal she described. Investigators later determined that the light she claimed was red would only have been triggered if another car was present, contradicting her claim that no other vehicles were there. As questions about her account grew, attention gradually shifted from searching for an unknown carjacker to questioning whether the story itself was true. The focus of the investigation began to narrow around Susan Smith and what had really happened the night she reported her sons missing. As questions about Susan Smith's account grew, investigators pressed her with detailed questioning about the night her sons disappeared. Detectives reviewed inconsistencies in her statements and asked her to retrace her movements, but the answers continued to raise concern. On November 3, 1994, after 9 days of searching and mounting scrutiny, Susan Smith finally admitted that there had been no carjacker. She confessed that she had driven her car to John D. Long Lake in Union County, South Carolina, and let it roll into the water with her sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander, still strapped into their car seats. Law enforcement immediately went to the lake. Divers located the submerged vehicle, and inside were the bodies of Michael and Alex. With that confession, the case shifted from a missing children investigation to one of the most shocking crimes in recent American history. When Susan Smith reported her sons missing in October 1994, the story quickly captured the nation's attention. For 9 days, news outlets carried her tearful pleas, and communities across the United States followed every development in the search for Michael and Alex. A massive manhunt that drew volunteers, tips, and prayers from across the country. The revelation that she had fabricated the carjacking and drowned her 2 children stunned the public and sparked widespread shock and outrage. Many were horrified not only by the crime itself, but by the betrayal of trust after days of hope. Smith's false claim that an African-American man had abducted her sons added another layer of national conversation, drawing criticism and anger for inflaming racial tensions and prompting law enforcement to search based on a fabricated description. Local African-American leaders and community members expressed unease over how the allegation impacted their community during the search. The case became a defining true crime moment of the 1990s, a story that gripped the media, stirred national debate, and left a lasting imprint on how the public viewed both the crime and the power of media coverage. After her confession and the recovery of her sons' bodies, the case moved from investigation to courtroom. In 1995, Susan Smith was formally tried in South Carolina for the murders of her 2 sons. A jury heard evidence presented by prosecutors, including the events leading to the deaths of 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander, and the days that followed. The defense called witnesses to discuss Smith's background and emotional state, and expert testimony was introduced about her mental health. Prosecutors argued the evidence showed Smith intentionally killed her children, while her lawyers portrayed her as psychologically troubled. After deliberation, the jury found Susan Smith guilty on 2 counts of murder. They declined to impose the death penalty and instead sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years under South Carolina law. The verdict and sentence were announced in open court as part of the official public record, marking the end of the trial phase and the beginning of Smith's long imprisonment for one of the most widely reported crimes of the decade. After the guilty verdict, the case moved to sentencing. In 1995, the jury considered whether Susan Smith should receive the death penalty or life in prison. Prosecutors argued for death, while the defense highlighted her background and mental health. The jury recommended life imprisonment, and the judge followed that recommendation. Under South Carolina law, her sentence included the possibility of parole after 30 years. The sentence was formally entered into the court record, concluding the trial and beginning Smith's long-term imprisonment. After her 1995 conviction, Susan Smith began serving a life sentence in South Carolina. In prison, she participated in work programs, maintained her faith, and expressed remorse for her actions. In 2024, after serving 30 years, she became eligible for parole. At her first hearing, she apologized and requested release, but the board denied her parole, with victims' family members, including her ex-husband, opposing her release due to the severity of her crime. The murder of Susan Smith's 2 sons in 1994 shocked the nation. Her false claim of a carjacking had sparked a massive search, only for the truth to emerge. She had driven her children into a lake, ending their lives. Convicted of first-degree murder in 1995, Smith was sentenced to life in prison. Her case remains widely discussed in contexts of filicide, mental health, and media coverage. In 2024, after 30 years, she became eligible for parole, but she remains incarcerated, while the memory of her children continues to resonate across South Carolina and the nation. Susan Smith's story is one of tragedy and deception. The deaths of Michael and Alexander left a lasting impact on their family and the nation. Decades later, her name remains tied to the devastating consequences of her actions. Her life in prison, parole hearings, and continued public scrutiny serve as a reminder of the questions surrounding guilt, punishment, and accountability. Ultimately, the memory of the children lost continues to outshine the life of the woman who took them. This case still raises so many questions. Do you think this was a crime of cruelty or a desperate act of a troubled mind? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading every single one. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories every week.